Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So it was 1995. It was Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, Dick Armey of Texas, now recycling himself shamelessly as a Tea Party insurgent. Oh, my God. It's like Carmine DeSapio saying he's a reformed Democrat back in New York in the 50s and 60s. The machine becomes the insurgents. Oh, my God. They wanted to force the cutting and gutting, the same agenda of the New Deal social safety net, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment, aid to mothers with dependent children, farm price supports, which were still around, student loans. So Gingrich then said, if you don't give me what I want, I will block the raising of the debt ceiling. And the day that he made this announcement, the dollar went down 5% in one day. Now, I submit to you, in the current situation of an economic depression and financial depression gripping the world, if you go to this brink, you will not get the dollar going 5% down in one day. You will get 25% down or maybe 50% down in one day, and that will blow up the world. That will pull down the rickety arrangements that we still have in the world that allow the production and sale and transportation of goods and services around the world. It is an action with genocidal implications, especially when you get further down the road to places like Somalia or Bangladesh and Ecuador and Bolivia and places like this. And let's just get into this now. In the middle of this crisis, Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico came forward to say that he had been meeting with a group of 10 Wall Street insiders, and these looked like they were hedge fund operators. One of them was Stanley Druckenmiller, who was, of course, from the Soros group at that time. And these Wall Street insiders had assured Domenici that if it came to a choice between eternal deficit spending and living beyond your means and rising debt, if it came to a choice between that and a default, the bankruptcy of the United States, something that's never happened in all of history, the United States fails to make a payment, that the Wall Street people thought that default would be, of course, a bitter pill. It would be unfortunate, but in the long run, it would be better. Now, here's my premise. I want to stake a firm policy position. Any government official who knowingly courts, promotes, or connives to make the United States go into default, who contributes to the national bankruptcy of the United States, is guilty of high treason. And there is also a little matter of wars. There's a war in Iraq. There's a war in Afghanistan. There's a war in Pakistan. There's a war probably in Yemen by now. Somalia also seems to be a theater of war. Basically, every country around Iran is also a theater of war. If you attempt to bankrupt the United States government and force it into default under those circumstances, it is high treason. The Constitution says the Congress shall have the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. And if you attempt to sabotage that provision, saying, no, the Congress should not have the power to borrow money on credit of the United States, and we're going to enforce that by extra-legal means. We're going to do it through Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's, through the debt downgrade and the inability of the U.S. to float a bond issue, then you're violating the Constitution. That's already impeachable right there. So impeachment first and then the rest. Now, the other thing is, it will always be possible to show the conniving. Domenici was lucky. No charges were brought against Domenici. I called attention to this in my journalism at the time. What Domenici had done was to enter into a conspiracy with these hedge fund operators and essentially say, well, they're telling me that this is what we should do. Now, did he come forward and say, I have examined these hedge fund operators to find out if they have conflicts of interest, if there's insider trading and conflicts of interest going on, because these hedge fund operators are simultaneously shorting the dollar, shorting U.S. Treasury bonds, Treasury securities, and otherwise taking a short interest or short view on the economic prospects of the United States. Are they selling this country short? Are they selling the United States of America down the river? Domenici never referred to this question. He never said whether he had quizzed them or asked them about possible conflicts of interest of the kind you can see on, CNBC when an analyst comes on. You can find out whether they own the stock, whether they've shorted the stock, or whatever it is. It will always be possible to show that members of the legislature have been conniving. Once you have subpoena power, you can go after them, which the Justice Department will continue to have. You are probably going to be able to show contacts between them and people who are doing the shorting. And I believe you can still find on the Internet Peter Schiff, the failed reactionary candidate in Connecticut. He says the default of the United States would be a good thing. Why do they want it? Remember, these are right-wing anarchists. Their theory is to starve the beast. That means essentially bankrupt the federal government. Their idea is that if you cannot borrow money, if you destroy the full faith and credit of the United States government and make that into a laughingstock, then the United States government cannot borrow for any reason. And this of course, includes war. It's the same story. This is where you get into the little matter of a state of emergency and several wars, quite a few wars going on now that you didn't have in 1995. But they feel that the response to the inability to borrow will be to force the government to live within the realm the realm of the tax income, the tax revenue, and that will mean, of course, the destruction of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, Head Start, WIC, and all the other essential programs that make up the tattered remnants of the New Deal safety net. And again, they will probably say, well, no, we'll do it in such a way so that the defense budget is shielded. Well, once you have a default, you can't borrow for any reason. So they'll say, we'll maintain the funds going into the defense budget. But, of course, once you can't float a bond issue, it's not clear that there'll be enough for that either. So this is a recipe for catastrophe. Such an event, again, in 1995, it was a minus 5% in the stock market in one day. If it's minus 25%, I'm sorry, not in the stock market, but in the dollar in one day, if it becomes this mudslide, then you have a world catastrophe. Remember, if you read Surviving the Cataclysm, my compendium of essential knowledge on real economics, not this Austrian school baloney, no Austrian baloney, but American system nourishment, you will see that the nightmare of Paul Adolph Volcker, as long as he was at the Federal Reserve, was that once the dollar began to slide, and we now have this, once the dollar began to slide, it might turn into an unstoppable mudslide, as we've seen, in the California valleys when it rains too much and the vegetation is not enough, or various places in Latin America. The whole side of the mountain comes down, and there's no force available to stop it. We now may be very close to this, so we cannot allow a bunch of right-wing anarchists in the Congress to throw their crazy weight around at the expense of the American people, because make no mistake, the national bankruptcy and default of the United States would be catastrophic for the average American working family. It would be a catastrophe. And it's very easy to make facile statements about this, how the U.S. is bankrupt and all this stuff. It's baloney. The U.S. is viable much more so than Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. As a matter of fact, as I've said repeatedly, Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's ought to be quaking in the criminal dock because of their corruption in 2008, when they were telling you that Lehman Brothers was AAA and subprime was AAA until minutes before the bottom fell out of the whole thing, and those poor schmoes who believed them will be left high and dry. So that's the question. And, of course, even somebody with the mediocre political skills of Clinton was able to cast Gingrich, Army, and the rest of them as villains in 1995. The big problem we have is Obama is such a weakling, such a wuss, such a bungler, so devoted to Wall Street, so remote from the American people that it looks like he might capitulate. He might then pitch the United States into chaos. That would then put him in the same dock along with these other perpetrators. We'll be back in a minute.